Good evening from Toronto, where the Massey Lectures, commissioned each year by the CBC, are presented on ideas. This year's Massey Lectures are given by Jane Jacobs. Her topic, Canadian Cities and Sovereignty Association. There are 5 half-hour lectures in this series. You will hear the first one tonight, and the others on succeeding Monday nights. When Jane Jacobs' classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was published in 1961, William H. White, author of The Organization Man, called it, quote, one of the most remarkable books ever written about the city. Planners may dispute the conclusions, White said, but they're going to have to think about them. They did. So did many politicians and community leaders around the world. The physical planning and sociological success of Toronto today largely bear out Jane Jacobs' theories of how cities can and should work. With the publication of her book, The Economy of Cities, in 1969, just after she had moved from New York to Toronto, where she now lives as a Canadian citizen, Jane Jacobs' place among important contemporary social theorists was assured. Here's Jane Jacobs with the first of the 1979 Massey Lectures.
The other day I asked a bright young electronics engineer from the West, born and now living in British Columbia, brought up in Alberta, what he thought would happen in the forthcoming Quebec referendum. It's a question I often ask. In reply, what I usually get is a statement, either indifferent or impassioned, of how the person I'm addressing feels about Quebec separatism. But this time I got a flat, forthright prediction. They'll vote no, he said. Why are you so sure? I asked. Because, he answered, nothing really interesting ever happens in Canada. Now, I myself have no idea how the referendum will turn out, so I'm not going to speculate about that. But I agree with my young friend that sovereignty association is an interesting possibility. In this talk, I'm going to speak of the feelings people have about separatism and discuss the reasons why sovereignty association has risen as an issue at this time. Next week, I plan to describe how Norway and Sweden contended with separatism, and I'll follow that with a discussion of the size of nations. Then I'll get into the subject of sovereignty association itself. As an idea, sovereignty association can mean 2 very different things. It can mean new arrangements among already existing nations, as in the case of the European Economic Community or the younger 5-member Andean Community in South America. On the other hand, it might also mean new arrangements among parts of already existing nations, as has been tentatively suggested by some European separatists, and as René Lévesque is proposing. That second version of the idea forces us not only to think about sovereignty association itself, but also to confront the idea of separation or secession. It's hard even to think about separations because the subject is so charged with emotion. Sometimes people literally acknowledge this when they say it's unthinkable. Nationalistic emotions are dangerous, of course. They've helped fuel many a war, many an act of terrorism, many a tyranny. But they are valuable emotions, too. One thing they mean is that we're profoundly attached to the communities of which we are part, and this attachment includes, for most of us, our nations. We care how our nations fare, care on a level deeper by far than concern with what is happening to the gross national product. Our sheer feelings of who we are twine with feelings about our nations, so that when we feel proud of our nations, we somehow feel personally proud. When we feel ashamed of our nations, or sorrow for them, the shame or the sorrow hits home. These emotions are felt deeply by separatists and equally deeply by those who ardently oppose separatists. The conflicts are not between different kinds of emotions. They are conflicts, rather, between different ways of identifying the nation, different choices as to what the nation is. For Quebec separatists, the nation is Quebec. For their opponents, either inside the province or outside it, The nation is Canada, defined as including Quebec. Trying to argue about these feelings is as fruitless as trying to argue that people in love ought not to be in love, or if they must be, then they should be cold and hard-headed about choosing their attachments. It doesn't work that way. We feel. The feelings are their own argument. The irrationality of all this shows up in universal patterns of inconsistency. De Gaulle, who said, "Vive le Québec libre," never said, "Long live a free Brittany," or "Vive la Provence libre." He could feel for separatists abroad, but not for separatists at home. This pattern is perfectly ordinary, perhaps always has been. The same Englishman who ardently favored Greek independence from Turkish rule in the 19th century did not therefore also campaign for Irish independence from English rule. Rationally, the one would certainly follow from the other. Emotionally, no. British support of Pakistani separatists at the time when India became independent did not imply any comfort or support for Scottish nationalists. Just so, many a Canadian who opposes Quebec separatism was sympathetic to the unsuccessful Biafran secession movement in Nigeria. I know some of those people. The same Canadians who can argue eloquently that justice and good sense both are on the side of Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Walloon, Kurdish, or Palestinian separatists can maintain that Quebec separatists must be out of their minds to want something so impractical and destructive. Separatists are quite as rationally inconsistent themselves. If and when they win their way, they always promptly forget their championship of self-determination and oppose any further separation at home. The colonies that became the United States declared their independence on the grounds that their grievances made it, quote, necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. It's often been remarked how inconsistent this is with the war waged by the northern states against the secessionist Confederate states some 77 years later. Today's newly independent nations are one and all against their own separatists or potential separatists. As one student of government has put it, leaders of these new regimes are desperately concerned to argue that self-determination can be employed once in the process of securing independence, but that it cannot be resorted to subsequently. Finland, after having achieved independence from Russia, promptly refused the right of self-determination to the population of the Åland Islands. They were ethnically Swedish and sought to break away from Finland with the object of joining Sweden. Pakistan, having won its own separation, then went on to fight the separation of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, and so on. We can be sure that if Quebec negotiates a separation, it will oppose adamantly, whether then or thereafter, any separations from Quebec. That's the way all nations behave, no matter how old or young, how powerful or weak, how developed or undeveloped, or how they themselves came into being. These emotions, of course, are always being presented as reasoned and reasonable, but that doesn't always stand up to inspection. Take, for instance, the word balkanization. Spoken with the ring of authority, balkanization can be made to sound like a compressed history lesson proving the folly of small sovereignties. But what about the Balkans, really? Before they became small and separate sovereignties after the First World War, they had been portions of very large sovereignties indeed, the Turkish and Austro-Hungarian empires. As portions of large sovereignties, they had lain poor, backward, and stagnant for centuries. That's how they happened to be poor and backward when at last they became independent. If a fate called balkanization means anything reasoned at all. It has to mean that the Balkans were somehow made to be poor, backward, and generally unfortunate by having been cut up small. But that's simply untrue. Or else it has to mean that if Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Albania had been joined together in one nation after the Great War, or perhaps had been united with Greece to form a still larger nation, they would be better off now. Who knows? In the nature of the thing, there's no evidence either to support such a conclusion or contradict it. Consider a scholarly and rational-sounding prediction like this one for Canada if Quebec should separate. Quote, deprived of real authority or purpose, the federal state would simply disintegrate like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. That appears in a new book by a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. The trouble with his analogy is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not disintegrate because a successful separatist movement occurred there. It had its separatists, especially in the Balkans, some of whom were violent, but the movements were kept in check. The empire was defeated in a great war, and as it lay in chaos, it was deliberately dismembered by the conquerors. The analogy to Canada is so far-fetched historically and so specious factually that we can only understand it as an emotional cry of anguish, not a true account of how things are in this country. To understand why sovereignty association has become a serious issue in Canada at this time, we must look at two cities, Montreal and Toronto. They're responsible for what's been happening in Quebec. Between them, they have converted a province into something more nearly resembling a new nation. Nobody planned this outcome. Nobody even recognized what was happening at the time it happened. The events that worked this transformation don't go very far back. We can date them statistically as having begun in 1941, but that is simply because 41 was a census year. I suspect they actually began in 1939 with the war economy. Let's begin with the part played by Montreal. Between 1941 and 1971, Montreal grew enormously. In those 30 years, the city more than doubled its population, increasing from a little more than 1 million persons to more than 2 million. These were the years that led up to and included the Quiet Revolution, the turning point in modern Quebec history, when French Quebec culture came out of its shell, welcomed change instead of resisting it, and moved into the modern world. The 1960s were the decade of the Quiet Revolution. Immigrants from other countries contributed to Montreal's growth between 1941 and 1971. So did people from other parts of Canada, and of course some were born there. But the major influx of population was from rural and small-town Quebec itself. Previously, rural Quebecois had migrated into Montreal, of course, just as they migrated into Quebec City and to New England. But nothing in the past resembled this migration. It dwarfed previous rural-to-city movements within the province. Furthermore, the rapidity with which the movement happened, as well as the absolute numbers of people involved, was unprecedented. These French-speaking migrants into Montreal spent the 1940s and 1950s finding each other. The Quiet Revolution of the 1960s was then built on their networks of new interests and relationships in the arts, in politics, working life, and education. French culture in Montreal was in a quiet ferment as people built these relationships and put together ambitions and ideas they couldn't have developed even in a smaller city like the capital, Quebec City. In the 1960s, the evidence of this ferment burst forth in French theater, music, films. Talent and audiences had now found each other. There was a new and rapidly growing readership for Quebec books and periodicals. Writers and readers had found each other. At about the same time, for a combination of reasons, new kinds of opportunities finally began opening up to Quebecois in city professions and commerce. The most important of those reasons was the economic growth of Montreal. Until the early 1960s, Montreal still seemed to be what it had been, an English city with many French-speaking workers and inhabitants. But now, because of the growth and the accompanying cultural processes I've just described, Montreal had become a French-Canadian city with many English-speaking inhabitants. By the time people in Montreal, let alone the rest of Canada, recognized what had been happening, it had already happened. Out in rural Quebec, the old stronghold of French culture, another kind of quiet revolution was taking place. From farming villages, fishing villages, market towns, and mill towns, hundreds of thousands of people, especially young people, were trickling and then pouring into Montreal. As the stream swelled, it had its effects on education and aspirations. But life also changed for many of the people who stayed put in rural Quebec. 1 million extra city people eat a lot, and even though many of these extra city people had previously been eating on farms right there in Quebec, feeding them now involved city trade and city money. With this growing city market, and so many young people leaving the villages too, equipment to improve rural productivity, tractors, trucks, piped water, electrical appliances, began showing up in places where in the past there would have been neither money to buy them nor much reason to need them. All these changes had a profound effect on religious life in Quebec. Contrary to what most people believe, the Quebec religious revolution, meaning loss of authority by the Catholic Church, was not a cause of the city and rural changes I have mentioned, but a result of them. The local priest's word about the world and its ways was no longer the last word in settlements where almost everyone was now at least distantly acquainted with somebody who had been off to a Montreal university for a secular education, or in settlements where people now went to the movies when they got into town, or in settlements where changes in the everyday economy and everyday working methods had burst out of the bounds of traditional ways of doing things. One and the same force, the great growth surge of Montreal, was simultaneously undermining the old culture in the countryside, developing it into something new in the metropolis, and sending this new city-shaped culture back into the countryside. Now we need to bring Toronto into the story. Montreal used to be the chief metropolis, the national economic center of all of Canada. It's an older city than Toronto, and until only a few years ago was larger. At the beginning of this century, Toronto was only 2/3 the size of Montreal, and Montreal was much the more important center of finance, publishing, wholesaling, retailing, manufacturing, entertainment, everything that goes into making a city economy. The first small and tentative shifts of national finance from Montreal to Toronto began in the 1920s when Montreal banks overlooked the financing of new mining opportunities which were then opening up in Ontario. That neglect created an opportunity for Toronto banks. The stock exchange set up in Toronto for trading mining shares then merged with the old General Toronto Stock Exchange in 1934, and by the 1940s the volume of stocks traded in Toronto exceeded that in Montreal. During the great growth surge of Montreal from 1941 to 1971, Toronto grew at a rate that was even faster. In the first of those decades, when Montreal was growing by about 20%, Toronto was growing by a rate closer to 25%. In the next decade, from 1951 to 61, when Montreal was adding a bit over 35% to its population, Toronto was adding about 45%. And from 1961 to 71, while Montreal was growing by less than 20%, Toronto was growing by 30%. The result was that Toronto finally overtook Montreal in the late 1970s. However, even these measurements are deceptive as measurements of what was happening economically. Thought of as an economic unit or economic force, Toronto has in fact been a great deal larger than Montreal for many years. This is because Toronto forms the center of a collection of satellite cities and towns in addition to its suburbs. Those satellites contain a great range of economic activities, from steel mills to art galleries. Like many of the world's large metropolises, Toronto has been spilling out enterprises into its nearby region, causing many old and formerly small towns and little cities to grow. In addition to that, many enterprises that needed a metropolitan market and a reservoir of metropolitan skills and other producers to draw upon have established themselves in Toronto's orbit, but in places where costs are lower or space more easily available. The English call a collection of cities and towns with this kind of economic integration a conurbation, a term now widely adopted. Toronto's conurbation, curving around the western end of Lake Ontario, has been nicknamed the Golden Horseshoe. Hamilton, which is in the Horseshoe, is larger than Calgary. Georgetown, north of Toronto, qualifies as only a small Ontario town, one of many such in the conurbation. In New Brunswick, it would be a major economic settlement. The economic growth of Montreal, on the other hand, was not large enough to help create a conurbation. Montreal's growth contained itself within the city and its suburbs. That's why it's deceptive to compare population sizes of the two cities, and jump to the conclusion that not until the 1970s had they become more or less equal in economic terms. Toronto supplanted Montreal as Canada's chief economic centre considerably before that, probably even before 1960. Whenever it did happen, it was another of those things that most of us never realized had happened until considerably afterward. Because Toronto was growing more rapidly than Montreal in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and because so many of its institutions and enterprises now served the entire country, Toronto not only drew people from many other countries, but from across Canada too. The first 2 weeks I lived here, back in the late 1960s, it seemed to me that almost everyone I encountered was a migrant from Winnipeg or New Brunswick. Had Montreal remained Canada's preeminent metropolis and national centre, many of these Canadians would have been migrating to Montreal instead. In that case, Montreal would not only be even larger than it is today, but, and this is important, it would have remained an English-Canadian metropolis. Instead, it has become more and more distinctively Quebecois. In sum, then, these two things were occurring at once. On the one hand, Montreal's growth in the decades 1941-1971 shook up much of rural Quebec and transformed Quebec's culture too. On the other hand, Toronto and the Golden Horseshoe were growing even more rapidly. Montreal, in spite of its growth, was losing its character as the economic center of an English-speaking Canada, and was simultaneously taking on its character as a regional, French-speaking metropolis. These events, I think, are at the core of Quebec's changed and changing relationship with the rest of Canada. Things can never go back to the way they were when an English-speaking Montreal was the chief economic center of all of Canada and when life elsewhere in the province was isolated and traditional. These changes are not merely in people's heads. They cannot be reasoned away or even voted away. Nor are these changes merely intensifications or extensions of the old French-Canadian grievances. A culture can persist without its own metropolitan capital, as Quebec's did for so long, but it cannot flower and thrive without one. Quebec does have its own cultural metropolis now. But Montreal, to continue thriving as a cultural capital, must also thrive economically. Yet, as a regional Canadian city, Montreal's economic future is unpromising. To understand why this is so, we must be aware of Canada's customary view of economic life and its traditional approach to economic development. The Canadian approach emphasizes exploitation and export of resources to the neglect of industry and services based on manufacturing. The experience of Canada has been that the largest and most quickly obtained fortunes, whether public or private, come from resources: furs, timber, apples, coal, iron, nickel, gold, silver, grain, cobalt, fish, uranium, hydroelectric power, oil, to name some of the most influential. Societies, like individuals, are shaped by their experiences. Canada's get-rich-quick experiences with resources have helped mold the nature of all the country's major institutions: the national government, the provincial governments, the banks, and other financial establishments. Those experiences have shaped the way venture capital is used, the way subsidies are used, the kinds of development schemes considered attractive, and the thinking of almost everyone in authority. These are not easy things to change. When one dominant approach to economic life and wealth has been pursued as consistently as it has been here, and for as long as it has been here, the experience gets thoroughly built into the works. It especially gets built into the uses of capital. Dazzling sums of money are available for resource exploitation and for a few other schemes, usually of grandiose proportions. Although there are some exceptions, especially in Toronto, almost no capital goes into development of many, many small, humdrum and humble kinds of city work. It's this kind of work, taken all together, that builds up creative city economies and, along with them, an industrially and commercially strong national economy. Canada's regional cities have their traditional role. By default of other functions, they work primarily as service centers for the exploitation of resources from their hinterlands. To be sure, all have some manufacturing, even the small ones like Halifax, St. John's, Thunder Bay, and Saskatoon, as well as the larger ones like Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, and the largest, Vancouver. But large or small, they have not served, at least so far, as creative economic centers in their own rights, creating new kinds of exports and replacing imports. That is why so many Canadian inventors and creative entrepreneurs must traditionally leave Canada for other countries to put their ideas to use. Or if they do manage to get started here, must then typically sell their enterprises to American companies to get capital for development and expansion. That is also why Canada, taken as a whole, has developed so little manufacturing, and why so much of what it does have, even in Toronto and the Golden Horseshoe, is undertaken in branch plants spun off from other countries, especially the United States. That is also why Canadian regional cities boom while the exploitation of their hinterlands is booming, as is happening in Alberta now, but then characteristically stagnate when the resource exploitation reaches a plateau. We have now a difficulty unprecedented in Canada. We have never before had a national city which lost that position and became a regional city. We have one now. Montreal cannot sustain the economy it has had in the past, or retain its many other unusual assets if it subsides into becoming a typical Canadian regional city. If that is all Montreal does, it will stagnate economically, and probably culturally too. In short, Montreal cannot afford to act like other uncreative Canadian regional cities. It must be the kind of place in which enterprises can develop new, innovative city-made products and services, and can take to producing locally wide ranges of former imports, and can find capital to help this happen. If Montreal cannot be that sort of place, it will be in grave and gathering trouble. The chances are small that Montreal will be able to transcend the usual inertia of the regional cities if Quebec remains a province of Canada. As Montreal's troubles deepen, Quebecois are certainly going to believe they would do better by taking their economy into their own hands. They might not do better, of course. They themselves might cling to the traditional Canadian approach to economic life and neglect other possibilities. But the point is, Quebec is now headed for trouble because of Montreal's new situation, and the traditional Canadian approach is not going to help. Inevitably, whether or not they would do better on their own, the Quebecois are going to think they could. Perhaps they even might. This is why the issue of sovereignty association, now that it has been raised, is not going to evaporate. The changes underlying that issue are irreversible, and they are not going to evaporate. Until the issue is somehow resolved, it is going to be raised again and again and again. In one guise or another, it will go on and on and on. Thus, it seems to me that we'd better think about it, emotionally painful though that may be. We're not the first people to find ourselves beset by the nagging of separatists. Next week I'm going to go back 70 years and describe a situation like ours, and how it was resolved peacefully.
Living in New York in the 1950s and 1960s, Jane Jacobs, who was an associate editor of the magazine Architectural Forum, saw large American cities being ruined in the name of urban renewal. The downtown superhighways and huge apartment projects were creating a wasteland, inhuman, inefficient, and unsafe. By watching and describing neighborhoods that worked and were safe and friendly communities, and comparing them with the crime-ridden engineered environments that were threatening them, she produced one of the most influential books on cities to be published in the past 2 decades. It was called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Then, in the late 1960s, Jane Jacobs moved to Toronto and almost immediately became involved in the community fights that went on between 1969 and 1975, finally changing the nature of Canada's largest city. The words I've just quoted are from a column last week in the Montreal Gazette written by Graham Fraser, author of Fighting Back, Urban Renewal in Trefan Court. And now, here's Jane Jacobs with the second of the 1979 Massey Lectures.
Last week, I discussed the reasons why the question of sovereignty association for Quebec has risen at this time, and why it will likely arise again and again until it is somehow resolved. This evening, I'm going to describe what happened in the case of Norway's separation from Sweden. As far as I know, it's the only instance of peaceful separation of a province or region from a country with which it was geographically joined. To be sure, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Iceland all became independent in peace. So did a few of the still newer nations, which were formerly colonies. But those were overseas possessions of empire. Norway was right there at home, right beside Sweden, the country from which it seceded. We know little from actual experience about the immediate practical effects of peaceable separations. New sovereignties that were former provinces or regions of another country have almost invariably come to birth in one of two ways. They've won independence after armed insurrection, highly disruptive terrorism, or civil war. Or else they've emerged, as the Balkans did, or as present-day East and West Germany did, as a sequel to military defeat, prostration, and dismemberment by conquerors. You see the difficulty. It's hard, if not impossible, to sort out the immediate practical consequences of such disasters from the immediate practical consequences of the separations. This is only one of many reasons why the case of Norway's peaceful separation is interesting. Although the separation occurred in this century, in 1905, it seems to be little remembered. Perhaps precisely because the tale lacks blood and thunder, it has become forgettable. But it does not lack conflict and struggle. The kinds of irrational emotions I mentioned last week were present in all their force. Offhand, it might be supposed that Norway was a special case, because once upon a time, long ago, it had been an independent kingdom. But think of Scotland, Ulster, Wales, Burgundy, Aquitania, Catalonia, Bavaria, Sicily, Saxony, the Ukraine. One could go on and on. Nothing has been more common than the reduction of kingdoms, or powerful dukedoms, to provincial status. Norway lost its independence, in fact, in late medieval times, and then lost it in form, too, in the 16th century, when the Danish king decreed that Norway had ceased to exist as a realm and was henceforth part of Denmark. This was how things stood until 1814, when Norway became one of the chips lost and won in the Napoleonic Wars. It was given to Sweden. At this time, Norway was a poor and undeveloped place. Although its economy improved somewhat over the next 91 years while it belonged to Sweden, it was still very poor in 1905, at the time of the separation. So we must visualize Norway's struggle for independence as taking place in two small provincial cities, Oslo and Bergen, a few poor and old towns, and the scattered and isolated settlements of subsistence farmers. Norwegians today marvel at the succession of their great men, generation after generation, who emerged from the narrow, drudging, tradition-bound life and built the country's independence. At the time Norway was transferred from Denmark to Sweden, there happened to be a few months' hiatus between the signing of the Treaty of Transferal and the assumption of rule by Sweden. During this moment of accidental freedom, a group of Norwegians proclaimed independence and called for an assembly representing a cross-section of the population. That assembly, held in the small town of Eidsvoll, just north of Oslo, went to work feverishly. In 10 days it managed to write and adopt a constitution, and authorized itself to create a national bank and a currency. The Constitution provided for a constitutional monarchy and a national legislature to be called the Storting, meaning great thing. At the time, the Constitution was the most democratic in Europe. It was also so well constructed and so workable that it still serves as the Norwegian Constitution today. But grand as all this sounds, it was pitiful too. Sweden had made its own very different plans for Norway. In Swedish eyes, Norway was now in effect a province. The arrangement in form was that Sweden and Norway were two kingdoms under one crown, like Scotland and England in the United Kingdom. Indeed, the form was proposed to Sweden by the British. The actual rule was set up this way. In Stockholm, the king appointed a cabinet of ministers for Norway, composed of Norwegians. They lived and worked in Stockholm and served at the king's pleasure. On matters affecting both Sweden and Norway, these ministers joined with the Swedish ministers in one cabinet. On matters affecting only Norway, the ministers for Norway and the civil servants on their staffs were the Norwegian government. So, in effect, these ministers constituted both the provincial government of Norway and a portion of the national government. In Oslo, a governor-general was ensconced to represent the king and to see that the will of his government was executed. In view of all this, the Storting and the Norwegian constitution would seem to have been rather in the realm of folk fantasy. Perhaps that's the way the Swedish government thought of it. Let them have their fantasies, if it amuses and occupies them. At any rate, Sweden, to its great credit, never forbade the Storting or tried to suppress its elections, never arrested or otherwise harried its leaders and members, and never attempted to censor its debates or interfere in its communications with the Norwegian people. By means of persuasion, during the first 2 years of Swedish rule, the Storting managed to pry loose 2 little fragments of autonomy. Sweden had made what seemed a generous offer, and probably was, the opening of military and civil appointments in both realms to people of both, on equal terms. The Storting rejected the offer, and the rejection was respected by Sweden. This closed off to Norwegians the prestigious and ample opportunities of public life to be found in Sweden. But, of course, it also meant that Swedes could not occupy government posts within Norway, and the members of the Storting evidently thought that was worth the sacrifice. The other point won was that Sweden agreed to separate its own debts from the debts incurred on behalf of Norway. In this way, the Norwegians limited their own financial responsibility for Sweden, but at the same time they insisted on taking their full share of a national debt, without also having powers to determine the size of the debt, the way the money was raised, or what it was to be used for. The Norwegians were also determined to use their own bank and currency, which that hasty meeting of the Constitutional Assembly had authorized. And amazingly enough, they did so for a period, although later Sweden tied the money to its own. After independence, Norway again had an independent currency, and still does. Thus, 2 persistent themes were set from the beginning, and thereafter ran through Norway's entire struggle. One was the Norwegians' lack of fear, poor though they were, about taking financial responsibility for their own affairs. Indeed, their positive eagerness to do so. The other was their strategy of seeking and grasping whatever bit, piece, or symbol of independence they could find, no matter how irrational it might be in the context of what they did not have. They didn't win another of those fragments until 1821, when they got themselves a flag. Not a national flag, which they would have liked. That was denied them, on grounds that Sweden's flag was their flag, too. Nevertheless, a flag, which they got permission to use on their mercantile ships, as a commercial emblem in northern waters. Years later, they won the right to use the trade flag on all the oceans. Thus things went in the Storting, symbol or substance, push, push, push over the years, always for a little bit more. In 1837, they won another fragment of financial responsibility, the right of local taxpayers to govern local expenditures for purely local matters. Not all the ideas came out of the Storting. Early on, a poet conceived the idea of celebrating the adoption of the Constitution by the Eidsvold Assembly. His idea caught on. It soon became a great Norwegian national holiday, and still is. Up to 1859, the conflict, though earnest, was on the whole very tame, but the Storting was turning balky, digging in its heels. It managed to hold off 2 governmental changes adopted in Stockholm, and also asked Sweden to abolish the office of Governor-General. Sweden refused. Now, before we plunge into the political crises that are going to follow, we need to be aware of other excitements brewing. During all this time, Norway lacked, or thought it lacked, a language and culture of its own. The language of the pulpit, the press, the schools, the government, the capital city, all educated people, and many who were uneducated, too, was Danish, owing to the centuries-long Danish occupation and rule. Nowadays, it's called Dano-Norwegian. Even in Dano-Norwegian, Norwegians had produced little literature, so the Norwegians assumed they had no culture of their own, as that word is usually understood. Then in 1851, 2 young Norwegians published a collection of folk tales they had picked up by traveling among the villages and listening. The book created a sensation in Oslo. In the first place, the stories themselves were a revelation. Their originality, fantasy, and beauty revealed a side of the national character Norwegians themselves had hardly appreciated. But the real bombshell was the language. The authors had incorporated into Dano-Norwegian as much indigenous Norwegian vocabulary and idiom as they could, while keeping the work understandable to city readers. A new style had been born, based on a preference for selecting words of Norwegian origin. The style produced a new language over the course of time, called Neo-Norwegian, which by the 1890s became a second official language, making Norway bilingual, which it still is. About the same time the folktales were published, a battle shaped up between improvers and preservationists over whether to tear down the ruins of an ancient cathedral in Trondheim. The preservationists, who won, were headed by Norway's leading historian, who used the battle as an opportunity to educate his countrymen in the achievements and civilization of medieval Norway. In sum, beginning about the middle of the 19th century, Norwegians began to understand they had a history in which it was possible to take pride, a language it was possible to enjoy, and the beginnings of a literature of their own. The excitement this generated was rather overdone, if anything. According to an English historian of modern Norway, anything done by a Norwegian in the arts and sciences, commerce, and even sport had always to be vociferously acclaimed as the triumph of a specifically Norwegian culture. Alongside the nationalist ferment rose another movement, also idealistic and exciting, which ran counter to independence, a movement called Scandinavianization. Its object was the unification of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden into a single nation. The Swedish king favored the movement. So did many people in all 3 countries, and many Europeans outside them. Unifications were in the air everywhere. The German principalities were uniting into the North German Confederation, which became the German Empire. Austria and Hungary were sealing the union that was to hold the joint empire together for half a century. Here in Canada, the time was nearing for Confederation and the British North America Act. In the Scandinavian countries, the movement for unification flourished for some 20 years. Then abruptly, in 1864, it collapsed. Now let us get back to the Storting, which we left in 1859, when Norway had been turned down on its proposal to abolish the Governor-General. The Swedish government had remained a good deal more placatory and patient with the cantankerous Norwegians than the Swedish people had. One can see why Swedes were becoming impatient. Sweden had acted very decently toward Norway, within the framework of the conception that Norway was a province. But the Norwegians would not meet the Swedes halfway by taking some pride and pleasure in the association. When the issue of the Governor-General was raised, the king had been willing to agree, but he was stopped by angry Swedish public opinion. Instead of backing off from this hostility, the Storting continued to press the issue of the Governor-General so persistently that finally, after 14 years, it got its way. The king abolished the post, and in its place created a new office, Minister of State for Norway, a position analogous to that of Prime Minister. The gain for Norway was the implication that the center of Norwegian authority was now in Oslo, not Stockholm. This change was only the first step in a much more ambitious Norwegian scheme, attainment of responsible government under a true parliamentary system. The Storting passed a bill providing for the ministers to sit with it and be responsible to it. It was promptly vetoed by Sweden. Hostility between the two peoples mounted further, and tensions increased to the point that during the next 30 years, until separation, there were at least 3 occasions when it appeared that either Sweden or Norway might take up arms against the other. During a good part of this perilous period, opinion in Norway was split, although separatists were always in the majority. Within the Storting, a split existed that was tailor-made for dissension. In election after election, the party favoring separatism was returned with decisive majorities, but the quasi-prime minister, the new Minister of State for Norway, who had replaced the Governor-General, was a unionist. The government civil service consisted of unionists, too. The actual leader of the Storting majority, who was the leader of the separatists, was without formal power. Crisis of some sort was inevitable, and it came. What happened was that the separatist majority proceeded to amend the Constitution to require responsible government. Of course, the measure was vetoed. So the Storting passed it twice more, each time after elections that returned larger and larger separatist majorities. After the third passage, which the separatists claimed overcame a veto, according to the Constitution's own formula for amendment, the Storting ordered Stockholm's Norwegian ministers to obey the amendment, come to the Storting, and start being responsible to it. Of course, they refused. A legal wrangle of stupendous complexity followed. Overruling the courts, the Storting proceeded to impeach the ministers, convict them, levy fines against them, and declare their offices forfeit and vacant. Through all this, tempers in Sweden rose, and so did tempers in Norway. This was one of the occasions when violence appeared probable. The Norwegians feared a royal military coup, which had been rumored. Volunteer rifle clubs began organizing to resist a coup. All along, the Swedish government and king were voices of moderation, but now they had only 2 choices. Either Sweden must enforce its rule by military means, which clearly meant civil war, or else it must accede to the Storting's demand for responsible government. Sweden chose the peaceful course. The king asked the leader of the separatist party to form a cabinet. Government of Norway by Norway, the grand and pitiful public fantasy of Eidsvoll 70 years before, had actually become a reality. The uses to which the Storting put its new powers were on the whole exemplary from a democratic point of view. It concerned itself with such things as introducing the jury system for criminal cases, improving the school system, providing for locally elected school boards, extending suffrage. More ominously, it reorganized the Norwegian army on a more democratic basis. From this point on, the Storting could count on the army. Things calmed down for about a decade. The Unionists accepted responsible government as a fact of life, and even won an election or two because of splits in the Separatist Party over personalities and strategies. But beginning in 1888, the conflict flared up anew, this time shifting to economic issues. Norway was poor. Sweden, although better off, was underdeveloped and relatively poor too. And in an effort to encourage manufacturing, it adopted a policy of very high tariffs. It directed those tariffs quite as much against Norwegian imports as against those from other nations. Perhaps there was some element of satisfaction here, some element of retaliation against Norway for having won the great tussle over responsible government. The Norwegians, with an economy already so close to the bone, felt as if the bone itself were being gnawed. The only way Norway could compensate for losses of its trade with Sweden was to find more customers abroad for the work of its merchant marine fleet. But here Sweden had Norway in a bind, too. As far as foreign affairs were concerned, Norway was still a part of Sweden. It contributed to a joint consular service. Norway now desperately needed consular help in finding and servicing new markets for its cargo shipping, and Swedish consuls were not that interested in hustling for Norway. So the Storting resolved to withhold its consular contributions and to establish unilaterally a service of its own. The king vetoed the measure. The veto had to be countersigned by the ministers, but these were no longer Unionists and would not ratify the royal veto. The government was dissolved, and a cabinet of Unionists was then appointed by the king, but it could not govern a Storting and a people who would not be governed by it. In Sweden, public opinion against Norway was again rising, and again there was talk of war. Now it was the Norwegians' turn to realize they had only two choices. They could make war to establish their independence, or they could pay up their contribution and try to negotiate more attention to their needs. Norway chose the peaceful course. It paid up and negotiated. But no agreements could be reached, and the talks broke down. Tempers in both countries grew uglier. The Norwegians embarked on a strong rearmament program for their military forces. Again, war looked imminent. This time, it was Sweden's turn to back off. It did so by suggesting a compromise, permitting separate consular services under a single diplomatic staff, and negotiations began again. In reality, however, the Swedish position was hardening, and the talks got nowhere. By this time, even the Norwegian Unionists, who felt betrayed by the Swedish negotiators, were ready to embrace secession. Plebiscites were called in Norway. Great demonstrations were mounted. The country was in an uproar, and in the spring of 1905, the Storting, now organized into a coalition government of all parties, unanimously passed a bill demanding thoroughly separate consular services. This was the final crisis. It was over and done with swiftly. The form it took was a legalistic deadlock, a kind of Gordian knot. When the king vetoed the bill, the ministers refused to countersign the veto and resigned their offices. All this was somewhat familiar. But this time, the king refused to accept the resignations, because that move had worked out as such a mess the last time. In refusing, he said, "No other ministry can now be formed." The words of the king meant one thing in Sweden, that Norway must now knuckle under. But in Norway they were chosen to mean something different. There the prime minister, a Bergen shipowner much admired among his countrymen for his quick-wittedness and efficiency, quick-wittedly used the king's remark to mean that the king himself had dissolved the union. His argument was that the king, by announcing no ministry could now be formed, had announced he could not constitutionally rule Norway, and so had dissolved the union himself. This went over as a great idea in the Storting, which passed a resolution on June 7, 1905, that Norway's union with Sweden was at an end, and then proceeded to act as the government of a fully sovereign state. Of course, this did not quite end the matter. As you might suppose, a tense time followed. But once again, Sweden recognized that it was a matter of war or peace, and so it resolved matters in this fashion. If the Norwegians would agree to meet certain conditions, then Sweden would be willing to negotiate for dissolution. The chief conditions were that Norway should dismantle its border forts and create a military neutral zone where its lands and waters abutted Sweden, and that Norway must hold a referendum to see whether its people actually did want dissolution. The Norwegians had already scheduled a referendum. It produced an outpouring of votes overwhelmingly in favor of Norwegian sovereignty, and negotiations promptly started. They were complex and difficult, but now Sweden had accepted the fact of secession, and Norway, for its part, recognized it was being dealt with in good faith. In this atmosphere, the arrangements moved rapidly, and were readily accepted in both countries. In Norway, a historian has written, the feelings of relief and of enhanced self-respect were comparable to those which other peoples associate with the winning of a major war. It is difficult to say whether the outcome did greater honor to Sweden or to Norway. Let us say that it not only did honor to both, but also to civilization. The separation, as it turned out, harmed neither country. On the contrary, it was probably helpful to both. The conflict, which could only have grown uglier and more dangerous, was disposed of. Sweden was better off economically in the years to follow than if it had had to carry on its back a poverty-stricken province, as likely would have been the case. Norway, although it went through hard times in its struggle to develop a modern and prospering economy, did succeed in doing so, and with a verve and inventiveness that it is hard to imagine Norwegians could have exercised, had the government and people been preoccupied with bitter political grievances. Today, each country is the other's best customer. Here in Toronto, in two different office buildings, one on King Street, the other on Yonge, are to be found two trade commissions, one Norwegian, one Swedish. To me, the two establishments seem more than pleasant, busy, competently run commercial offices, staffed by cheerful, alert people. To me, they seem the concrete evidence of a miracle. A separation achieved without armed rebellion, without terrorism, without military defeat of a former ruler. In the Swedish office, I recently asked one of the civil servants how Swedes really feel toward Norwegians today. Do they harbor any feelings of resentment about the secession? He looked shocked at the idea. Of course, no, he said. We make jokes, and he blushed. The same jokes you tell in Canada about Newfies. But the Norwegians are good neighbors, good customers, our best, and they have made a fine country for themselves. Then he added reflectively, we wanted them to like being with us, but... and he shook his head. There are many obvious differences between Quebec and Norway and between Canada and Sweden. Quebec, for one thing, is better developed economically and richer than Norway was at the time Norwegian sovereignty hung in the balance. Nor is the form of sovereignty association that René Lévesque has been proposing as thoroughgoing as the sovereignty Norway achieved. But there are similarities, too. Quebec, for some years, has been taking step after step toward autonomy, and these moves, as in Norway, jumble symbols with substance, demands for responsibility with claims to cultural pride, economic concerns with political concerns. Canada, for its part, is similar to Sweden in its recoil against the idea of civil war or use of military force to keep Quebec in its place. Canada is also similar to Sweden in not wanting its province to separate, and in wanting Quebec to take pleasure and pride in being Canadian. The government in Ottawa, like the government in Stockholm, is a voice of moderation in comparison with the anger and hostility against Quebec vented in such places as letters to the editor columns, many newspaper editorials, or on the part of some of the provincial governments. If Quebec does insist on moving toward sovereignty, I have an unshakable feeling that Canada's behavior, like Sweden's, will do honor to civilization. That conviction is one of many reasons why I happen to identify emotionally very strongly with my community of Canada. One of the real differences between Norway and Sweden on the one hand, and Quebec and the rest of Canada on the other, is that Norway and Sweden are so small. In my next talk, I'm going to discuss whether it's an economic disadvantage for a nation to be small, and I'll explore some paradoxes of size generally.